All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. I'm really excited this week because we have the fabulous author with us, Sofia Samatar, author of A Stranger in Alondria and other cool things.
Whoa.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Being heard by everybody?
You cut out for a second.
Okay, well, good. Now we're connected. Super. I'm very excited to have you, Sofia.
Thank you.
Hopefully my internet will be more reliable going forward. I did a lot of work on this last night to try to make it better. So we'll see how we go. So A Stranger in Alondria was Nebula nominated when it came out. And I believe you received an award from, was it the, am I remembering this correctly? Did you get an award for the book?
I did. I got a couple of awards for the book.
I thought you had. But I can't remember the name of the award that I remembered seeing you get, so I apologize for that.
No problem. There was
a fantastic book.
Yeah, thank you so much. There was the it was the British Fantasy Award that you might have seen, and there was also the Crawford Award for debut, and then the World Fantasy Award for best novel.
Fantastic. I remember seeing the BAFTA come across my radar. That was the one I was trying to think of, and I couldn't put it together in my head. So I'm so happy to hear that you've got so many awards for this book because it is super, super fun. And one of the things that really stands out about it is world building, which makes it, yay, super appropriate for a visit to my show. I actually had the pleasure of interviewing Sofia at the Nebula Awards when she was nominated, and it was a really fun chat. And one of the things I remember you saying, Sofia, was that you were deliberately casting aside restraint. Am I remembering this correctly?
That sounds like me. It does.
Tell me about that choice.
Well, this is interesting because I don't remember exactly what I said to you or what the context was, but I know that in writing A Stranger in Alondria, I really wanted to write the book that I wanted. So when you say to me that I told you I was throwing away restraint, I think about just embracing genre, but not being tied down by the way that it's been done before, and sort of pushing it to see where it could go and how it could turn out to be something that I really wanted to read myself.
Okay, cool. What I think I remember you saying was that you had been frustrated with the tradition of, minimizing description and making sure that things were kind of, I don't know, high-paced, stripped down, something like this. The thing that stands out about Stranger in Alondria is just the richness of the setting and the connections with literature, and you've got all kinds of dimensions that get explored that don't normally get explored. I think in the books that I read in the genre. I mean, obviously, I think maybe this is starting to happen more, possibly inspired by you. But what did you think about that?
Well, I think, I guess on the one hand, I would say thank you, first of all. But I would also say that I don't think that the richness of the world of Alondria is necessarily something new. I think, I mean, if you look at Tolkien, I didn't do, I have vocabularies, I have lists in several different languages, but I don't have completely constructed languages that someone can speak.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if you look at the other really big influence, or one of the other big influences within genre was Mervyn Peake for me, and the Gormenghast books, which are also, in terms of the description, very rich and very, Mervyn Peake took his time over creating that world and creating every scene within it, I think.
Mm-hmm. So, how many of the people who are attending have read Stranger in Alondria? I'm just wondering. Anybody? Okay, well, you guys have a treat in store. Let me tell you. Okay.
It's on my wish list for years on Amazon. I just can't really afford books.
So given that, Sophia, why don't you tell us a little bit about Alondria and how it's working for you? Maybe we could also talk about what you're working on for your new book, which is a sequel, right?
That's right. The sequel is called The Winged Histories, and it is scheduled to come out next March, so March 2016. What was the question? To tell you about about the world?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how you created Alondria and your inspirations for it.
I created it by wandering around in it. So both A Stranger in Alondria and the sequel, The Winged Histories, that's coming out, were much longer. They were huge, enormous drafts. A Stranger in Alondria the first draft was twice as long as the final. The Winged Histories, much longer, maybe 3 times, maybe even 4 times as long as what's going to be published. Wow. So what I was doing was just I would in the character that I was writing, I would go and wander in these different cities and walk around in them and write scenes that really, as far as what the books are trying to do, those scenes didn't need to be there, but I needed to write them in order to sort of really get a sense of place. So that's how I did it. It took a very long time. I don't necessarily recommend it as a practice.
Well, I hear you on that because I think I'm not sure how extensively people do this, because I agree there's a certain benefit in aiming to write the number of words that is eventually going to end up needing to be on the page. However, that said, I do see a lot of value in what I call exploratory drafts, which sound exactly like what you're talking about, because when you have a world and it is very complex, you want to make sure that you know what is around that corner, and sometimes in order to discover what's around that corner, you need to write about it, because whatever you find there may inform the plot, and you might not know how it informs the plot yet, for example.
Yeah. Absolutely, and sometimes, I mean, for me, a lot of the time, it was also about understanding more about atmosphere. So I might, in one of the in-character wanderings, be in a part of the city, the capital city that's very old, that has where the university is, and so on, and just 1 or 2 comments about that might actually wind up in the book, but there is a sense that I have of the age of that place and the sort of, the debates that have been held at the university and the conservatism of the place and so on. And that does, I think, soak into the atmosphere of the published book, even though the debates and the history and so on aren't there anymore and don't need to be there.
Right.
I've heard other people talk about, they may not necessarily call it part of their draft, but just of going off and writing separate scenes or separate chapters that they know aren't. Okay, that's
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the things that I have studied that I have found very helpful, that may actually shed some light on this, is that the way that we use words differs dramatically depending on our understanding of the social consequences of being in a place and speaking. And so even though, you know, the age of the place or the debates that have happened there, those things might not be mentioned, but at the same time, a character who has been involved in that or who knows about that might speak about it in a different way with that social awareness that they are part of an ongoing discourse of whatever academic whatever is going on at the university than they would if they were simply somebody walking in off the street with no knowledge of what the university was.
Sure. Yeah. And in terms of the idea of sorry, this thing is it's repeating everything I say, so it's throwing me.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'll just soldier on. In terms of this idea creating things where you go off a little bit off the plot and you don't actually consider it to be part of your draft. I think the difference between people who do that and me is that those people are more self-aware about what they're doing. I called it a draft because I just didn't know. I sort of taught myself to write. I taught myself to write by writing A Stranger in a Laundry. I certainly taught myself how to write a novel that way. So now I can think, yeah, that's a great idea to kind of write little things that you know aren't going to be in the book, but that they're going to contribute to the world building. At the time I was doing it, the only concept that I had was I'm writing a book. I wasn't self-aware enough to see it that way.
So are you still having the issue with the repetition?
It went away and then it just came back.
Okay, so that might be okay. What I will try to do is when I'm not talking, I will mute my microphone, because often what will happen is that repetition is a result of feedback from somebody else who's on the loop. So I will try to make it so that doesn't happen anymore by muting my microphone.
Thank you.
But I wanted to say that is very, very interesting. But I mean, I suppose it doesn't matter whether one is doing this deliberately or whether one is just doing it sort of out of a natural feeling of I'm writing a book and exploring, so long as the understanding ends up being there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have main characters that you would like to tell us about? In A Stranger in a Laundry, you have this sort of island young person who ends up in a laundry. So part of what makes this difficult for me to talk about is I feel like I am trying to fit vast worlds of information and coolness into the tiny things that I'm saying. But one of the things that is really cool about Stranger in Alondria is the way that you have at the start this amazing setup for the protagonist and his culture and his background and how he's first exposed to the concepts of literacy and the culture of Alondria, and then this very different kind of thing that happens when he goes over and actually visits Alondria for himself and gets tangled up in all kinds of other things. So, yeah. Maybe you could tell us about the cultures or something?
Sure. That's a pretty good. So, A Stranger in Alondria is about a young man named Jevik. I'm really getting that echo again. Sorry. Trying to what I'm saying. So, A Stranger in Alondria is about a young man named Jevik who comes from a non-literate culture. So there is not reading and writing where he is. And he travels to Alondria. He has a tutor that teaches him how to read, and he travels to Alondria where there is a highly literate culture. And while he's there, he becomes haunted by the ghost of a young woman from his own country, and then tied up into a sort of battle between different Alondrian religious cults. But so the setup at the beginning, where I'm really placing people in Jevik's culture, which we then leave and we all, go to Alondria and experience something that's totally different. But it was very important to sort of put those two ways of knowing side by side, the oral and the written, and to have them both expressed through worlds that were, or places that were equally fully realized.
All right, I really think it's probably my microphone which is causing the problem, and so I'm going to have a hard time jumping onto the ends of things that you're saying. But yeah, I think that I like the way you put it as ways of knowing. I think one of the things that tends to be discounted in our culture is the value of an oral history or an oral recitation kind of culture where knowledge is passed on in these very, very particular and valuable ways that just don't happen to be written down. And so I think it's really great that you were exploring that. It's one of the things I love. So will you be revisiting Jevik in this new book, or is this going to be exploring different areas of the world?
That's a great question. Thank you. So the new book, The Winged Histories, is related, but it's also a standalone. I mean, you don't have to read A Stranger in Alondria first. It is set completely in Alondria rather than going back and forth between different places. And Jevik is not mentioned by name. He is there in one sentence in the memory of someone else. So there's a connection between the two books historically, but not through the character of Jevik. There's another a priest's daughter who is sort of a secondary character in A Stranger in Alondria, is one of the main characters of the Winged Histories. So related but independent.
What's the chronological divide between the two books, if I may ask?
Sure. The Winged Histories comes very, very soon after A Stranger in Alondria. So in terms of time, there's even maybe a tiny bit of overlap in time between the two books, but almost directly after.
So could you tell us, can you give us a hint as to a little bit about the plot?
Sure. So The Winged Histories is, it's told from the perspective of 4 different characters. These are 4 Alondrian women from different parts of the empire. One is a soldier, one is a scholar, one is a poet, and one is a socialite. And these 4 characters are caught up in a sort of a religious and ethnic war that is going on that is very much connected to events in A Stranger in Alondria. So in A Stranger in Alondria, you start to see this building religious conflict, and then that becomes full-fledged in The Winged Histories.
Wow, that sounds really fascinating, actually. Other people on the discussion, help me out here because I keep having to mute myself whenever I'm not talking. So if you have an idea while Sophia is talking, by all means do jump in. We're going to try to overcome the technical issues here. Let's see. I'm actually curious if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit more about the nature of that religious and ethnic conflict.
Sure. Complicated, no surprise there. So Alondria is not just a country, it's an empire. So it is, you know, there's a central area, which is referred to as the valley, which, you know, people say it's one of the Alondrian provinces, but everybody really knows that it's the most powerful one, and it is people from that province that took over the other provinces, either through war or through sort of economic pressure. So it's an empire, and that means that within it you have all these different kinds of interests that are boiling, and you have resistance movements that flare up and die down again over time. And one of the things that the Alondrian Empire has done is to impose sort of a, not completely impose a state religion, because they're different gods and different people are, you know, dedicated to different gods, and it's not that singular, but there is the main goddess of Castella, which is one of the provinces they took over, has been outlawed and replaced with an Alondrian goddess instead. So that's one place where sort of ethnicity and religion are connected, and, you know, in a way that leads to resistance and to violence. And then on top of that, you also have the new cult, which has risen to power in A Stranger in Alondria, which is now, you know, trying to overcome what's been there in the past. So there are several pieces that are wrestling. Some of them are, you know, you would say more strictly religious, between sort of different cosmological interpretations, and then in others there is definitely a connection between religion and ethnicity.
She's taking notes.
As you were describing
that, I always take notes. It's because I end up writing reports, sometimes very, very late in the game. I got 2 reports up today, right before the hangout started. But yes, I like to make sure I have my notes so that I don't lose all this very cool stuff, because if I have to if I have to re-listen to the whole thing and then transcribe everything, it takes me like 30 times as long. So, but okay, so I'm actually really fascinated by all of this. What I recall learning about was that you had spent time in Africa, and that this had been an influence on your thinking, at least. What do you consider it to be a direct source of some of the possibly cultural material or sort of mindset issues in these books that you're working with?
Definitely. I definitely consider it a direct source in both novels, actually. In A Stranger in Alondria, that is a book that I wrote in Sudan, in what's now South Sudan, when I was working as an English teacher. I was teaching English in a high school, and that was a period when this sort of tension, sometimes a tension, sometimes really a conflict between oral and written forms of knowledge and expression was something that became very present to me because I was sort of living in the midst of it, and I was there to help people, help people make a transition from a more oral mode into a more written mode. And I had been asked to go, and I was honored to go, and all of that. But at the same time, it did raise a lot of questions for me in terms of what I was participating in and what's hard to see if we're in the midst of something and we say, here's a problem that needs to be solved. People don't know how to read and write, and they have to learn. And then there are all kinds of things happening there, and there are losses happening as well, language loss and cultural loss that people don't think about at the time, or maybe we're not able to see it at the time. So that was very much what led to my writing A Stranger in Alondria in the way that I did. The Winged Histories is a lot more concerned with gender than A Stranger in Alondria was. I think A Stranger in Alondria certainly is a bit, but it's much more of a prominent issue in the Winged Histories. And well, one of the things I'm looking at there is what happens in societies that have quite strict gender roles, and there's two genders, and the men do this and the women do that, and it's really quite strict, and their lives are to a certain extent quite separate, and the relationship between that and a kind of militarism and the way that separation supports certain kinds of violence. Many kinds of violence. I mean, violence in terms of the way people are permitted to think about themselves or prevented from thinking about themselves, but also the most sort of I don't know, graphic isn't the word, but sort of the most absolute physical violence as well. And that comes out of, some of my thinking about some situations of violence that I have either been in or heard about either in Sudan or in Somalia, where my dad was from.
I obviously just cannot write fast enough. I'm working on it. Thank you. That is, yeah, absolutely. So, okay, let's see, very cool. Can anybody else here help me out with the follow-on from that? I'm getting thrown off by my microphone having to be turned off all the time. I really think this. I think this issue of the gender question is actually really interesting. So that sounds very, very cool. So, am I correct that there was really only one point of view in Stranger in Alondria?
There were two. I mean, there was the primary one, certainly. But then there's a section in the book where this ghost that's pursuing him is insisting that he write her story, and so he does, and he writes it, in her words, first person. He's sort of taking dictation for her. So there's mostly one perspective, but there's a section that's from this other perspective. Whereas the Winged Histories is much more, it's really split. It's four different sections, each one with a different main character.
Are they interleaved with one another, or are they sequential?
They're sequential.
Okay, that's interesting. It is very. It does make me think very much of Tolkien and the way that he was writing in the sort of large sequential chunks of different points of view in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So okay. So I'm going to ask you another question about that then. So I'm actually fascinated to see what comes out of the sequential points of view. Did you have a very specific kind of intent in choosing the points of view and ordering them, or did it just sort of flow naturally out of your process?
The sections basically flow chronologically. I guess maybe the first two are really chronological, and then the third one and fourth one are sort of happening at the same time. So part of what directed the way that was organized was just what was happening at what time and which character was positioned to see the most important things that were going on. So that was a lot of what guided the organization there. I'm seeing a question over here in the chat box from Morgan. Should I answer it, or do we do this later?
By all means. By all means, feel free to answer it. So the question, as I am understanding it, is it's about Jevik and his diary and the way that he gets the view of the ghost. Morgan? Okay.
Yeah, it looks like a question about whether Jevik is taking down the story in the actual words of the ghost, or whether his understanding is influencing how he tells her story. And it is the former. He's taking dictation. He is writing down her words as she speaks them. So it's a first-person section of the story that is in a very different voice from Jevik's voice.
It's a really interesting choice to do that.
Thank you.
In Stranger in Alondria, you talk about this particular disease, and I think, if I'm recalling it correctly, there's a genetic component to it that strikes certain people of Jevik's island. Is that something that does disease or other factors like that also figure in the Winged Histories?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's also hard to answer without giving things away. But I would say that in both novels, both of these books are about identity, they're about culture, they're about memory, and they're about history. And so you have, on the one hand, you have oral histories that are told, you have histories that are written down, and then you also have kind of, genetics is also history, right? It's also, something that is traced through time in the body. So that does figure in both books as another form of history, I would say.
I got you skirting the spoilers. Sorry about that. Yeah, so, okay, cool. Let's see. So I'm going to ask a question, actually, that I thought of when you were talking about the four women as points of view characters, and I'm going to kind of link it back to the question that you raised of these different cultural groups. I'm taking a guess here. Are the women who are the points of view in Winged Histories, do they range through the different cultural groups at all? I mean, is there a deliberate contrast that you're looking for between the various points of view, and how does that work?
There is. There definitely is. Two of them are sisters, and these sisters have they are connected to the royal family, and they are mixed. So they actually, their background is from all three of the different major Alandrian provinces. And that is, that's considered good politically in terms of unification, but it's also considered negative socially, because they're not pure-blooded, but at the same time they are, supposed to be this new generation that is going to really unite all of these different areas in a way that nobody can ignore anymore. So two of them are from these sisters, these mixed sisters, and then one of them is Alandrian from the most powerful province, and one of them is Castaigny, so she is from the province that has been the most resistant to empire.
I'm looking forward to it already. Yeah, I mean, because in my own writing, I like to try to contrast points of view, and one of the major sources of fun conflict, I mean, I think, it's interesting. People often like to talk about cultural misunderstanding, but I think misunderstanding as a word doesn't really capture what is being expressed by this stuff. There's an enormous amount of drive and conflict that can come out of just very, very different ways of seeing the meanings of things and the significance of events. And so I'm getting a strong sense of that out of what you're describing, and I'm looking forward to getting a chance to read it. Now, your video seems to have frozen. Are you still there?
I'm still here, and I can hear you.
Okay, great. Cool.
I hope I'm making a good thing.
Well, you know what? This is awesome. I'm sorry about the echo thing. Is it still continuing?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, dear.
Oh,
dear. Well, I can hear it. Jay, can you hear it?
Yeah.
Oh, dear. All right. Well, I will keep shutting myself up. It just slows us down a little bit. Okay, so all right. Well, okay. So why don't I say I'm going to open it up to other people to ask some questions, because I need to get off so that other people will not have echoes and not be able to function. I'll see if I can interact in the chat bar. Maybe that will help.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shredder got nothing. If only Reggie were here.
A while back, when you were talking about the religious ethnic conflicts, it reminded me just a little bit of the Roman Empire. Was that one of your inspirations, or?
That's a great question. I think I would say yes, in terms of creating sort of this pantheon of gods and goddesses. both Greek and Roman mythology would have been influences there, and Egyptian as well, another big one. Of course, those are all kind of related. So, yeah, definitely.
I even heard an echo when you talked about the new belief coming in as possibly Christianity.
That's interesting. That's one of those things that you don't think about when you're writing it, and then someone says it, and you're like, maybe. Yeah, it's very possible. It's certainly in comparison with the religion that has, sort of been the ruling belief in Alondria for centuries. The new cult is extremely severe. It's extremely conservative. They are against, drinking wine and parties, and they really are very much. They're very passionate about the written word, and they're interested in sort of. You could say, I think it's fair to say, stamping out some of the older oral systems. So yeah, it's not something that I have really thought about before, but I think it makes sense. So I have a question here in the chat box. I think you said that a goddess was prohibited in an occupied territory. Why that particular province if deities weren't prohibited in other occupied territories? Again, a great question. So this is the territory that was taken over by force. It was a military conquest. It took a long time. There were several waves of military conquest, and it's the province that's the most resistant. So it's a place where the empire has felt it necessary to sort of interfere more seriously in the culture, and to have a sort of patron goddess that everybody worships, and to have all the rituals that are connected with that bring people together and so on, is all a way of keeping this resistant culture going. So the need that the empire saw to target that particular cult was because of the political resistance that it was enabling. And there's a comment from Juliet. She says that you did see a lot of merging of Greek with other religions, adopting the other gods in and changing their significance. That's absolutely so, and is true in Alondria as well. There have been over the years, new deities that have been added.
I'm going to start talking again. Sorry. I think that given that we are having this audio difficulty and we've covered a ton of things and it's 7 minutes to 3, that I'm going to say we'll draw to a close at this point. But Sophia, thank you so much for being here. It's been a fascinating discussion. I can't wait to see the Winged Histories when it comes out. And absolutely best of luck. This is, lots of intriguing stuff to look forward to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. Great question.
So unless there are any more questions, I'm going to stop the broadcast. Everybody cool? All right, thank you so much. Stopping the broadcast now.